Just waiting on audio-visual down the back. Oh! Good evening. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for coming. I hope supper was good. Big congratulations to Eliza Henry-Jones for her great session earlier in the day. Well done, you. We are, of course, meeting on the unceded lands of the Gunditj Mara and Peak Wurrung peoples of the Maar Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders. Thank you very much, as I said, for coming to Blarney Books tonight to talk to the wonderful Jayne Tuttle. Jayne comes from the bookshop at Queenscliff, which is one of the lovelier bookshops in the world. We can't say it's the loveliest because we're here at Blarney Books, but it's really close.
The second loveliest.
And there's so much to talk about that I'm almost worried about timing. So I'm just going to race on in. The things that you need to know about Jayne, and there are a great many, but where are my notes? Here we go. Jayne is a graduate of a very famous drama school in Paris, the name of which I will stuff up because I'm not a francophone. But could you name it for us, Jayne?
It's called the École de Théâtre Jacques Lecoq.
See why I didn't say
Or
it?
the Jacques Lecoq Theatre School.
Magnificent. She's been based in France in the past as an actor, voiceover artist, playwright, translator, and bilingual copywriter. Her debut novel, and that's a contentious term, I'll come back to the idea of the novel, but her debut book is Paris or Die, which came out in 2019, which was developed into a solo theatre show that toured around and, in fact, went to La Mama in Melbourne. Yeah. She's been awarded the Eric Dark Fellowship in 2021 from Varuna, which you've probably heard a little bit about Varuna earlier in the evening with Eliza. Co-owns the bookshop, as I said, and her second book is My Sweet Guillotine, which is this one. Now, none of that tells you anything about what goes on in these books, which is nothing short of extraordinary. There is so much interesting stuff in these books, not only about a central incident, which we'll come to, but about Jayne herself and about Paris and about life and relationships and women and all sorts of extraordinary things. Family. Can I just clear up a really boring thing first, Jayne, about the publication dates? So I saw that Paris or Die, both books on Goodreads are listed as released in September this year, but Paris or Die is in fact much older, isn't it?
Yeah, Paris or Die came out in December 2019, but with the release of My Sweet Guillotine, they wanted to re-release Paris or Die with a cover that sort of, because it's actually going to be a trilogy of books. So, yeah, they decided to re-jacket Paris or Die and give it a new little life, which was very exciting.
And it is really beautiful design, isn't it? I love those covers. They're great.
Yeah, and so it's in a small B format too, the little sort of sexy B format that you can pack in your bag when you're travelling. And
In an overcoat pocket.
Yeah, just...
Yeah. Now, I've heard you describe this writing as literary autofiction. And there is a Jayne who is the central character in these books, and there are people who are recognisable as people in your life, but this is, I gather, not quite memoir. Can you explain what the relationship is between this Jayne and you?
Yes. Well, this Jayne is very much a part of me, but not the whole me. I really feel like when you start to write, the minute that you put something down on the page, it's already fiction, no matter what it is. Well, you know, if you're writing a book about a historical event, then of course that's a different thing. But if you're writing from your own life, I don't know, I always struggled with the idea of what it was exactly that I was writing. And it tripped me up for many years actually as to what is this? Is this, because I was working from a lot of notes that I had taken when I was in Paris. And so, you know, which is taken very freshly from life, and you know, perfectly autobiographical. But then to actually fit it into the form of a book, you know, you have to find a way to tell a story. Unfortunately, I would love to just sit and ramble for 80,000 words about things that happened to me, but it's a bit boring. You know, there's a certain structure that a book or a story requires. So even if you're retelling a story, something that happened to you last night, you already, after you've told it a few times, you tend to start structuring. And so I I really struggled with what to name them, and then to a point where another writer actually said, look, listen, that's not your job. You finish what you're doing and then let the publisher worry about that, which is what I did. And so I don't really call it literary autofiction, but I love it when people say that because it's just another name to add to the list of memoir, literary nonfiction, creative nonfiction. I mean, it's a style of writing that has existed long before. I mean, sometimes we tend to think, oh, it's such a new genre, but it's not at all. You know, I just picked up an old Proust actually and thought, yes, you know, it's Proust did it. You know, Helen Garner does it all the time. You know, Annie Ernaux, one of my favourite writers, does that too. Writes from life, but still constructs a story. So I don't know. You tell me what it is.
I think I said to you, I was reading, before I picked these up, I happened to be reading A Movable Feast. And Hemingway is doing a similar thing, I think, in that he's talking about Hemingway in Paris. He's frankly not as interesting about Paris as you are. Controversial statement,
you heard
I
it
know.
From Jock Serong, 2022.
But there you have it. Now, we have to get to the thing that happened to you, Jayne, in Paris. And we have a way of doing this. Jayne mentions what happened to her in Paris several times across both books, but in particular, being an actor and writer, she has scripted what happened to her in Paris in this book, and Jo is going to come up and help us act this out.
Yay! Look how excited Jo is.
Because Jo loves microphones, as you know. So, Jo, if I could take you to page 9, please. Yes. Now, let's see how all this works. All right. So, Jayne, I think...
I should just introduce that this happens in the beginning of the book where this is such an embarrassing story, and I think that trying to recount it, which, you know, people ask a lot, what happened, what was the story of the accident? And what I would tend to do is go into theatre mode because it is it's the only way, you know, as we do sometimes, or as we do every day, you know, especially when things are a bit uncomfortable, we, you know, strap on our actor and we tell the story. So this scene was a way of describing how difficult it was to tell this story in a social context.
So I think, were you in a cafe at this point?
Yeah. Cafe Penis.
Cafe Penis. And you're telling this story to a group of people. You will be playing Jayne, and I will be playing the other people in the conversation, and Jo will be narrating. And Jayne, I think you go first.
Oh. From, you know, the old buildings? Okay. You know the old buildings here with the lifts in the middle of the staircases without protective enclosures around them?
Nods, murmurs.
Is that me?
Well, yeah, that was you. Keep up, Jo.
We haven't practiced.
Well, it was January. Paris was dark. My friend Sophie lives in a 1930s building in the 20th, and the lights were dim and the lift moved up and down in total silence, a finger's breadth from the banister. You could touch it. The protective barrier came just up to banister height, which was low, and I'm tall, plus I was wearing heels. Sophie's 4-year-old daughter Lou called from me from below. We were playing a game of hide and seek. I was excited to see her after a lonely winter breaking up with my fiancé. I was calling to her, Lou, and she was calling, Jayne. To help her see me, I leant slightly over the rail.
She illustrates the angle of the banister with her forearm and moves her head over as if to look down.
I could see Lou's face below.
She puts her other hand above her head as if to show the descending elevator.
And I didn't realise that I'd put my head in the path of the descending elevator.
English chick. Hand over mouth.
Oh, my God.
Moustache guy.
Whoa.
Jayne.
Luckily, the lift stopped and I managed to pull my head out from beneath.
Nadine.
A miracle.
English chick.
I feel sick.
The bookseller's daughter.
How did the lift stop?
Jayne.
I don't actually know.
French guy shaking his head.
Always so many accidents in Paris in these old buildings.
The bookseller's daughter.
Unbelievable.
English chick.
Then what happened?
Jayne.
I don't know exactly. I blacked out and fell down the staircase.
English chick.
But you pulled your head out.
Jayne.
Yeah, but I don't remember any of it. I came to on the stairwell and I fell down a flight of stairs.
The bookseller's daughter.
But you were okay?
Jayne.
Yeah, well, kind of. I was lucky. They didn't realise until later that I'd broken my cervical spine, my neck.
Nadine.
They put her in a soft collar to carry her to hospital. A soft collar. If she'd moved her head in any way, she could have died or been paralysed. Sorry, Janie, is this?
It's fine. I'm just glad to have survived. I just had some broken bones in my face and the neck fracture, which they didn't even have to operate on.
Nadine.
Because she was so young and fit from all the acrobatics at Lecoq.
Moustache guy.
Or was that falling training?
The bookseller's daughter.
Was there any other damage?
Not really. I was lucky to keep my ear, and there's this major artery there, the carotid artery, that can be fatal. And I had this amazing surgeon that stitched up my face with thousands of the most tiny stitches.
Moustache guy.
And what did they do about your neck?
They put me in this kind of new brace thing, a corset minerve it's called.
Nadine.
Like a robot contraption. She was suffocating.
I was okay. I got used to it.
The bookseller's daughter.
In England, they put bolts in your head, you know, with the poles, the scaffolding.
Nadine.
Australia too.
English chick.
You were in rehab?
I would have been, but my sister, who's a nurse, came and took me back to Australia to recover with my dad in his cottage by the sea. I've literally just arrived back.
Nadine.
She's recovered amazingly.
English chick.
Are you okay now? Do you have pain?
The bookseller's daughter.
You can barely see the scars.
French guy.
Why did you come back? And that's it. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Jane. Now, there is a sort of parallel story that you tell a couple of times that goes with that story, and that is, I've just got to track this down, page 16. I'll hand this to you if you like. Oh, yeah, sure. That little marked paragraph at the top.
When my neck is bad, I can't help thinking of the story my sister Kate told me about a man who has a head-on collision on the highway. He crawls from the wreckage, the sole survivor, and manages to walk to a nearby house. There's been an accident, he tells the person at the door. Where? They ask. Over there, says the man, turning his head to indicate, and he falls down dead. He had a C2 fracture, non-displaced, just like mine. If he'd kept his head forward, he'd probably been fine.
That's a terrifying story,
Yeah.
because it's the same injury.
Yeah, they told me that after my accident. So when it happened, there was this amazing thing. I woke up on this stairwell after the moment of feeling that I had, life was just about to go. And I had this voice in my head. My first instinct was to sit up and look around, like, where am I? What's going on? But I had this voice in my head that said, just look forward. Lie very still. And I just remember fixating on the wall opposite me, and just for the whole time they lifted me in the soft collar. They didn't realise there was a lot of blood. They didn't know that I'd actually broken my neck, so they just sort of lifted me and took me to the hospital. But I didn't. If I had turned my neck, it would have been terrible. But I just had this sort of instinct or voice in my head. I kind of, attribute it to some magical things. Anyway,
So
I was very lucky.
Let's go back all the way to the start to set the scene for all of this. Paris or Die is the first book, and in it you start off with your first stint in Paris when I think you were 22. Is that So why were we there?
We're there because we have studied French through high school, because there was a teacher who brought in croissants and took you out to long films starring Vincent Perez. And it was one of those things, like it was nice at school because there was this excellent teacher, and then I got to university and it was like, well, I don't know what I want to do, so I might as well just keep going with French. And then I finished French. I'd never been to Paris, like the sort of kids at Melbourne Uni had all been there and I hadn't been there. So I had this boyfriend and he dumped me. And I went, I want to die. And then I thought, well, if I'm going to die, I might as well work 3 jobs and save $5,000 and go to Paris. And so I arrived in Paris at 22 with nowhere to stay, just a backpack. And I somehow got myself a job as an au pair. And I lived in Paris for 6 months. I hated it. It was so incredibly lonely. And I didn't understand I was just trying to prove a point. I didn't know what the point was of being on your own. And then there was just this moment when I was there, when I was just towards the end before I left, I was sitting down on the river and I just had this moment on my own where I just looked out and I just saw the view for myself for the first. I understood. I was like, oh, this is what it is to be alone. It just hit me. And I think that was what drew me back to Paris after my mum died. I sort of that moment of aloneness that, I was one of 4 kids and had always had people around me all the time, and I'd never knew what it was to be alone. And so, yeah, I think...
Your descriptions of those moments of sort of realising Paris are quite incredible. And, perhaps the only thing more dangerous than a C2 fracture is the danger of writing cliches when you write about Paris. Oh, yeah. And you completely managed to sidestep. I wanted to read this little passage, which is one of those moments you describe where you're really seeing the city. And it's so original and unique. I want to be in. I want to stay here when the trees change, where it snows, where nobody wears helmets or obeys the road rules, where killing yourself by smoking is a fact of life, where being an intermittent actor is a normal job, where being alone isn't lonely anymore, where I can just walk and look at things and come home feeling full of life, like I've gorged myself just from looking, where the language sounds like velvet and water and caramel and honey, and letter writing is still a normal form of communication, where checkbooks will never go out of fashion, and nor will inkwells and quills and calligraphy artists, where bookbinders and button makers and violin shapers still work away quietly in their shops, where Sundays are still Sundays and the city is calm, where some days I dress up for the city and not for anybody else, put lipstick on for her, some eyeshadow, my nicest shoes, and just walk in her, where the completion of a task as menial as buying a stamp and sending a letter feels like a major accomplishment, where I feel alive, more alive than ever before. That's lovely. All right, moving on. You make a really interesting point just after that about heritage and about how the French understand themselves compared to Australians. And that is this point you make about, it's probably easiest if I read a little bit. I've never given my heritage much thought, and then it hits me, these people all know their history. They know they belong here, that the land is theirs. I'm not a native of Australia. I'm ashamed of what my ancestors did to the Indigenous people, and I feel terrible every day for living on their land. And yet I'm not English or Irish or Scottish. I don't belong there either. And I have never travelled the real Australia, the centre. I've lived only a city life, sipping tea and tending my English garden, eating Asian food, Italian, Greek, Indian. The people at this table eat and speak French in France and are French. It's a big difference, isn't it?
Yeah, that was a real... I remember being in Ireland as well and sitting around the kitchen table and someone pulling out a tin whistle, and thinking, they're still singing the same songs, and it's like... And French, there was that instant moment that night, I remember, because someone had asked me, Jayne, what is your history? And I said, I don't know, Irish, some Scottish, something. And they were shocked and disgusted that I didn't know. But I realised that I didn't really want it. I don't identify. I don't, and in some ways it was my conscience was far lighter living in Paris where I didn't belong, where I never would belong, rather than being in this country where I felt horrible, deep inside myself, that kernel of I haven't made enough effort to connect, but I don't know how, and I feel bad, it was just a relief to be far away from that and not have to think about it. But then it was a really sad moment where I realised, these people, they don't have to feel that because their ancestors was far, 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 far back are French, and they ate French food and they sing French songs. And, I just was really envious of what that must feel like.
And early on, you talk about the experience of trying to find your way into their society and being held at arm's length. And there's this sort of parable of the burnt baguette that you talk. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, well, and actually the smile in the voice is another one. Like the burnt baguette was a moment of when I was very young and arrived in Paris for the first time at 22 and came with my schoolgirl French and went along to, buy my first baguette and said, "Bonjour, je voudrais une baguette." And the woman went and gave me the burnt one. And I didn't know, I was so shocked, I didn't know what to say or do other than take the baguette and go back the next day and say, "Bonjour, je voudrais une baguette." Looking at me until I got so tired of it that I learnt and observed what was going on around me and finally walked in and said, "Bonjour, une baguette, s'il vous plaît." And there was a moment as well when later on when I was back in Paris where I was speaking French and a guy spoke to me back in English and I said, "Why do you know that I'm not French?" And he said, "The smile in the voice." And I said, "What?" And he said, when you speak, you have a smile in your voice. And I remember spending a very long time with my French boyfriend trying really hard to iron that fucking Australian smile. Like even I'm talking Australian smile. Le français, c'est parler comme ça. C'est parler comme ça, il faut pas moduler. And my French boyfriend said to me, "You care too much." And I said at one point, "Well, I don't know if I can iron that out and I don't know if I want to." They're desperate to disappear into this culture and lose all the Australianness because it was I found it a heavy weight, white Australian guilt,
Yeah. There's a lovely little moment when you're writing to your mum and you say you're writing a quick email telling her I've qua-arrived and I'm qua-live because the Q on the French keyboard is where the A should be. Can you perhaps read for us the story of your mum's illness and death is incredibly moving, and the way you describe it, I think, is really worth reiterating. That little passage there, Jayne.
When I was little, I would stand by my parents' bed in the deep of night, whispering, "Mum, Mum, Mum." Eventually, she would wake and let me in. 5 minutes, then back to bed. I would lie there, stiff as a board, as far away from her as I could get, hoping she would forget I was there, but I could still feel her warmth. Now I whisper, "Mum, Mum, Mum." She'll wake any moment and say, "What is it, Janie?" My French professor went missing once. There was a newspaper article saying he had disparu, disappeared. I kept waiting for him to come back. I learnt much later that the word actually means dead. The meaning of this was not fully apparent to me until the days and weeks after that strange and silent night. I kept looking for her, expecting to feel her, smell her, but she'd disappeared. No matter how hard I tried, how good I was, I would never see her or hear her or smell her again. Her absence was tangible, a hole sucking all the warmth from the planet. Months pass. The world feels warped. Everything is familiar and yet not. I'm angry at it for being the same when nothing is or ever will be again. How can the streets have the gall to look as they did before? The houses, the faces, my front door.
Thanks.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah.
Just such an intense, just the familiarity when everything is changed in your life. Just looking around and everything's you go back to work and everything's the same.
And the thing that really struck me is that the two books are written across years and years, and yet your mum keeps coming up again and again as a sort of backdrop to everything you're feeling and experiencing. Is that the way it was in the writing?
Yeah, I don't really think, I definitely didn't intend to do that in the writing, but it is. And Paris, I think, represents... I remember somebody said to me early after Mum died, she said, you will fill your life with other women. You will gather, and not from just women, but you will gather like a mother figure and it will be this sort of patchwork doll and it will be your And I remember thinking, oh, I don't want that, I want my mum. But Paris to me is largely that, because I arrived there after her death and there was this sensation of the comfort of the unfamiliarity and just never having to bump into anyone I knew, never having to put a smile on my face, being able to speak a different language and just not be me anymore was such a driver. So, yeah, and the mother is just a huge part of, a lot of the writing, I think, is about trying to keep a sense of that alive, if that makes sense.
And then in this book, there are two major relationships that emerge in Paris. One is your friend Kiki, and the other is the boyfriend Adrian. Can you tell us all a little bit about those two people? Because they're very central to all this.
Yeah, well, in terms of the mother patchwork doll, Kiki was an Australian artist who was living in the Cité des Arts when I was in Paris, who was a few years older than me, and straight away, she's a successful painter and knew how to live. And she was desperate to really enjoy every aspect of Paris, and she taught me how to boil an egg. And so she had just come out of her second marriage and was determined to just not be the good girl, and was always inspiring me to try everything with no shame and no sense of responsibility. So she became the head. If Paris was the body of the mother patchwork doll, then she was this huge factor for me. And Adrian was one of the things that Jayne says in the book when her Australian boyfriend, when she's leaving Australia for Paris, he says, you're just going to disappear you're just going to hook up with some Frenchman. And I remember thinking at the time, yeah, I fucking am. And I knew that I would. It wasn't that I had thought in my head I'm going to leave with a Frenchman. I knew all I wanted to do was hitch myself to a dark horse and disappear into the abyss. And here comes this perfume commercial French guy at a party stepping in with his cigarette that stays lit even though it's been raining outside, and he's pulling his coat off and it defies all laws of matter. And walks over to me, and it was like, okay, I'm on. I'm going to jump on you and I'm going to disappear and I'm never coming back. And he didn't speak English. He was just like a fantasy. So Paris or Die really explores that idea of like you think that you want that, but then when you actually get to the point of marriage and actually the reality coming up, it's a bit trickier. Yeah. Especially when they get to know you too and realise that you're a bit more complicated than not just the nice Australian girl.
This is an interesting point, because I couldn't work out whether in the end I didn't like him or that because we were seeing you through his eyes, there was something else going on, which was the problems he was having with you.
Yes. I really think that. And I really had to work hard to bring that, because the first draft of Paris or Die was like, fucking, he's an asshole. But I really, over time, I've understood a lot more about his position and how difficult it actually is, as an Australian woman, and as certainly an Australian woman in another country, we are a strange creature to a lot of other cultures. We are, and one thing that we have here in Australia is we have great relationships with men, like we're buddies, whereas that doesn't exist, especially in Parisian culture. You're either, together or you're not, or you've got something going on. The idea of a platonic relationship, like my relationship with Harry in the books, is very confusing to French, it was to Adrian, and he was a very sweet and insecure person, and as time went on that became clearer to a point where he couldn't cope anymore. And I think that I don't care about spoilers really that much, but because I think that, I don't know, what's to But I was just going to
spoiled the big
say,
dramatic moment.
one of the things that, Adrian disappears quite dramatically in the books, and I realised that he needed to do that in order to not become submerged again in this strange world we'd created, which was a little bit outside of reality.
Well, let's put this up for the people in the room to judge. In the aftermath of the accident, you're in a hospital bed, you're in a terrible state, and you asked for him, and he came.
And we'd broken up.
And you'd broken up, already. He came to your bedside, and that was a touching moment. But then the end of that touching moment is, and I never saw him again. So it's really hard to judge whether he should have done more, whether he had done what was asked of him, because I gather that you learned later that his reason behind that was somehow your irresponsibility had led to the accident.
Yeah, well, in My Sweet Guillotine, I have to gather a lot of evidence, because what happens is what actually happened is I went back to I actually ended up suing the building, which is a very un-French thing to do. And I had to gather a lot of information from people who were around the accident who saw, and Adrian was the first person I called after the accident happened, and he came and was with me during the surgery and stuff, and I needed a statement from him, and he made it clear to me that he thought that me doing the lawsuit was what he called venal, bitter, twisted thing to do that would make my friends have to pay for my accident, and that, insinuating that, he never said he thought it was my fault. It was me, thinking, he thinks it's my fault because I'm a papillon fou, But yeah, there's a cultural, but that's one of the reasons that I really was interested in that, was the cultural aspects that the lawsuit brought up between the French and the, Anglo US way of approaching these things, which is different.
Yeah, it's
Did
really
I answer the question?
You did.
Sorry,
it's strikingly different in the book, the attitude to litigation.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to do a terrible thing because I'm conscious that time is racing away from us, and I'm not going to ask you all the questions I wrote down about the Lecoq School, which is a fascinating part of this book in its own right. So I'm sorry I've done that. But before we move on from Paris or Die, can you talk a bit about the level of detail in the book, that you're taking us into meals and conversations and nights together in extraordinary detail? Now, is that because you've reconstructed this in your mind after all these years, or is it because you've kept a diary at the time, or are they just things you're making up?
Sometimes a bit of all. Like, a lot of it is notes. A lot of it is in Paris or Die. For the first 2 years I was in Paris, I religiously took, I said, I'll write a page a day. Doesn't matter what it is. I'm just going to, every night, come home from theatre school and I'm just going to write whatever's going on. Dreams, stuff that's happening in the theatre school, drunken rambles. I went in the construction of Paris or Die. It was so difficult because, and I know Helen Garner talks about this a lot, like trying to shoehorn these little bits of real life into, you've got this beautiful sentence and you're just like, that's so truthful, but it doesn't fit in the narrative, so it's a fight between the true chunks that you've got that you want to stick in, remembered events that you remember pretty clearly, and also, some little bits that you sort of probably make up, which I blame. Look, okay. I sometimes think I had a big smash over the head as well, and like the way I remember things a lot of the time is completely fictional. I will remember an event perfectly, and then I'll say it to my sister, and she'll say, "That happened to me. It wasn't you." We don't. Memory is such a fleeting, creative thing. It's not that clear. So I don't take full credit that every sentence was perfectly happened, but it is as truthful as I can possibly get it, because that, I think, is where it's interesting. That's what I'm aiming for.
I think that's the sense that comes through in the writing, is that you're never asking yourself, how on earth can she remember that was the thing that the person said? It's more a matter of all of it flowing past in a way that feels like it's a correct rendition of those years.
Yeah, I don't want you thinking as you're reading, did this happen? Is this true? I want you to be swept up and to be in the moment and to actually, I guess that's probably why it is a blur of style, because I love more than anything those true moments that you've recorded in life. You know, sitting here right now and going off now and just writing down exactly what it feels like to look out on this audience. Like, that is where it is for me. That's what I learn in the theatre school, is observation, and that's the most precious thing I learnt and I love. But actually fitting that into something that's a form that people can enjoy is not. It's really tricky.
It's an interesting reminder, I think, of how we all talk to each other, and there is a certain limit to the intimacy of the exchange. But then when you read memoir like this, where you're just bristling with antennae and noticing everything and noticing motives and mannerisms and little ticks, it makes you think, shit, we give away so much of ourselves in conversation, and the other person is thinking all the time. Particularly, God help us, if they're a writer. But
don't ever make friends with a writer, especially one who does memoir or autofiction or whatever it is.
Yes. Now we need to move over to My Sweet Guillotine. And this book starts with you mentioning, you compress time a little bit at the start, but essentially you're talking about going back to Paris after treatment and after recovery in Australia. And you mention almost in passing that your father had nursed you for 4 months and that there was an intimacy and an awkwardness about that, but that he coped and he was brilliant. And the sense I had was that in some way, had life been different, this would have been your mum, and that he had had to take up that role.
Yeah, gosh. Dad had moved out of our family home in Melbourne down to the beach into this little kind of, like a little miserable little cottage thing that he'd, he loved it, but it was really sad, you know. It was sort of our home, and the 4 kids had kind of all been packed up while I was overseas, and then here I am, and him trying to be, maternal, and actually, to wash your daughter, your grown 20 or 30-year-old daughter, is a particular thing. It was really beautiful in lots of ways, but I don't think I've even unpicked the half of what that must have been like for him and what it was. Yeah, he doesn't naturally have that maternal instinct. You know, when I got back, he'd gone out to Kmart and bought like a doona cover that he thought I'd really like, that had like lots of colours, kind of kendone, and it was really, that real crunchy kind of material, and he'd put like a little chocolate on the end of the bed to try and make it sweet for me, and made me his meat and 3 veg, and we watched the, Today Tonight. It was really beautiful and really sad in lots of ways, but he just had the job to do, and he got there. Yeah.
What about, though, in light of that, and in light of the fact that your recovery was still very raw, you were still really vulnerable physically and emotionally, and you've got all that love available to you there, how and why did you go back to Paris?
Yeah, it seems crazy sometimes when I think about it, and that question's come up a lot about this book. Why on earth would you go back to Paris after you've had this horrendous experience, like surreal in its horror, and yet it felt perfectly normal to me. It just was, I was there to get better. I mean, I was 30 and I was recovering really well. I was really lucky. I basically had this crazy brace that, kept my, body stiff. Eventually I was allowed to take the brace off, and as soon as it came off, I was back. And it helped that a group of actors that I'd worked with at the Lecoq School, we'd all made a little company, and one of them had got a grant to make a play that would be developed and performed in Portugal and then go back to Paris. So I was like, there we go, I got a job. And I remember saying to Dad, I think I'm going to go back to Paris. And he went, do you feel ready? And I said, yes. But in actual fact, the feeling of leaving was like going back to, that feeling when you were in kindergarten and you got dropped off and it was a bit early.
But just stopping there for a second, when your dad reacted that way, was any of it ever about him?
No. No, that's a beautiful thought, actually. He never needed me. I think it would have been quite sad for him.
Yeah.
Because, there was we drove each other insane, but there was a real beauty to it. But he never, I take that for granted completely. I think it was difficult for him because I think he was worried and he was very much in my, he was calling a lot when I was overseas for the back early. But no, he never said, oh, you should stay. And no, he knew that I wasn't staying.
Yeah.
He knew that I would go back and continue my life. I'd built a life by that stage. I'd built a whole world and yeah.
Now, when you get back to Paris, Kiki is now a bit in the background. She's sort of there in correspondence, but she's not there physically. But there's this lovely friendship with Nadine, and then there's this other relationship with a different man. Can you take us through both of those?
Yeah. So Kiki, the mother of the patchwork doll, is gone, and I am left with a friend who has been a bit of a distant friend. She's a very eccentric person and she's difficult. And she's the one who always sort of, one thing that I always wanted to do in Paris is impress the waiters and make them like me, and be really nice and try and get them. And this friend of mine, she would ask for, can I have that but with that sauce? And can we move to that table where there's sunlight? And she's difficult, much more complicated character than Kiki, who was much more comfortable in her own skin. She's a very sharp character, difficult but so full of love. She's the one who would sit beside me in the hospital bed and not move because she knew that if she moved, it would be horrendous. It would upset me. So she would just sit in the silence as the sun went down. I went back when I was recovering in Australia with my dad. Kiki came to visit and she bought a friend of hers that she was staying with, which I was really angry about because I'm this festy, horrible, amoeba. And she bought this friend of hers who she was staying with, who was a Melbourne musician, who she called M. And Em and I discovered that we both did the cryptic crossword, the DA, on a Friday, and he started to come down to rehearse with his band, and he would fill out a few of the Friday clues, and then I would take what he'd done and start to build on it. And we sort of developed. He started bringing music, and then he started bringing films, and then he started cooking a little bit, and then when I went to go back to Paris to do the show, or to Portugal to do the show, we needed a sound and light person. And I said, would you like to come? And he said, yes. So he came over to Portugal to do the play and ended up staying in Paris and becoming a friend, a close friend, a special friend.
And it was around that time that I started thinking about how intensely female these books are. That it is a window into a really feminine world in the sense of the way the friendships work, sexuality, clothes, food, everything. I suddenly understood that I was seeing the world through female eyes. And that meant that you saw him as a boyfriend in a whole different way to the way you saw Adrian. And the differences became very, very clear. And I think as a male reader, that's really interesting. It's like, I can see why he was being a prick. And why M didn't make some of the same mistakes.
Yeah, I think the feminine thing is really interesting. I remember someone in a previous talk asked me, how do you feel about your daughter? Because these books are pretty, a few people have said to me, are you embarrassed sort of walking around? I live in Queenscliff and we run the bookshop, and a few people are like, geez,
You don't hold back.
I don't hold back. And a person in the audience said, how do you feel about your daughter, my 11-year-old daughter, reading these books? And it just occurred to me when you were talking then that I think I'm driven actually by her reading these books. And what I want for women and young women to read as they grow up, because I want that. I want to know what it really is like, what is normal, what is... I don't know, like just the reality of what it is to be a young woman. The woman in Paris or Die, the Jayne in there, is a lot different to the girl in My Sweet Guillotine. The girl in Paris or Die she's like masturbating like fury. She's having sex, like 4 times a day. I can't even remember that. But the girl in My Sweet Guillotine is in a different phase, and her desire is different. Her desire for connection is different. In Paris or Die, she doesn't desire to connect with a friend, or in fact, in Paris or Die, she says, I didn't come over with Harry. Someone says, why don't you get together with Harry? He's like you. And she says, I didn't come over here to get together with my next door neighbour. I came over here to disappear and have that hot, passionate relationship. So I'm deeply. I love that you read these books. Full stop. Because I
it
want
would have been a
men
weird
to read
conversation
them.
if I didn't.
Yeah. Be like, But that's of interest to you, to see that feminine perspective, but also to understand the male perspective in it as well. To not feel that it's an exclusively female position that although you did say that you feel like a fly on the wall.
Yeah, there is that sense. But I think also the bottom line to me was both looking at it as a writer and as a person, that it's about living fearlessly, that you did, or Jayne the character did, in these years, live flat out and without fear, and then you've written it without fear. You're not cutting corners or compromising or being polite and distant.
Yeah, I guess I died, I almost died, and then my mum died, and in some way I feel like my life ended twice. I mean, that sounds extremely dramatic, especially from a theatrical person, but that's how it feels. I don't feel like I'm in it to do anything other than, I don't have anything to lose. Like, why not go there 100%? That's I mean, yeah.
That's beautifully put, and I'm going to change the tone jarringly. One of the reports on you during the litigation was to the effect that you had developed a macabre interest in macabre things, in research. And you do this beautiful little passage about decapitation. God help us. But I need you to read it, and then also the little bit that I've underlined at the bottom.
Okay, great. This is fun. Okay. The decapitated, it became known, do not die immediately. A man called Longyi, after decapitation, responded to the calling of his name. Another man, his head about to be put in a box with his separated body, looked up at the assistant with a look of supplication, as though asking for forgiveness. The gory details of what happens to the body and the head after the event didn't bother me. On the contrary, I needed to know. Information was calming. I read about hangman's fractures, the mechanics of elevators, the history of Paris architecture, the science of the guillotine. Poor Dr. Guillotine, who is against capital punishment and trying to find an alternative to the punishment of the day, burning at the stake, dismemberment, boiling, wanted to create a device that would inflict on the victim no more than a cold sensation on the neck. The machine, unfortunately, constructed by Antoine Louis, proved a more gruesome death than anyone could have imagined. They kept it anyway and gave it the prettier name, La Guillotine. The bigger the stories, the smaller mine felt. The bed was heavy with Dante and Kafka and Artaud and the existentialists and the surrealists and the nihilists and the absurdists and anyone who had been severely depressed, perplexed or mad. I looked up bizarre accidents, stupid deaths, hilarious near misses. Molière, who coughed blood and consequently died while on stage playing Argon, the malade imaginaire, the fake invalid who pretends he's dying to find out how his wife truly feels about him. Aeschylus, killed by a tortoise dropped by an eagle who mistook his bald head for a rock. One poor actor doing a sex scene on a piano that was lowered into the room by a hydraulic motor which accidentally went up instead of down and squashed him on the roof in front of everyone.
That's just horrendous. I know. So My Sweet Guillotine, in many ways, is the story of the litigation. And what really interested me about the way that the litigation started was that, in a sense, it was M who started it. It was he who went to the apartment building and took photographs it was he who said, have you thought about talking to a lawyer? And that seemed, the way he was, that he was very careful not to interfere in your life or to try to influence you, that seemed unusually assertive to me, a little bit out of character.
Oh, yeah, right. M worked in insurance while he was a musician. He worked as an insurance guy full-time during the day so he could make whatever music he wanted to do in the night. And so when we were back in Paris, he was curious about the accident and curious to know how it was possible and wanted to see the building. And I think at that stage I was pretty happy. Well, I said I was happy to just forget it happened. I didn't want to think about it. I wanted to be back in Paris, avoid the 20th arrondissement where it happened completely, and just go back and live as I did before. But he said, I think he probably suspected that that's not that healthy, you know, and especially to... Anyway, he suggested that he go back to the building and have a look at it just to see. And that was one of the most horrible moments. I remember it lasted so long because I remember thinking he's going to go to this building and he's going to see how stupid it was what I did and that it was really hard to do. Like I had to somehow climb up on the thing for it to happen, and he was going to come home and think I'm mad and actually literally send me off to the madhouse. That's how I thought. I thought there were people waiting outside that were going to take me to the madhouse. In fact, he came back and he said, oh my God, I cannot believe that you survived. I cannot believe how dangerous that is. It could happen to anyone at any moment. It's so dangerous. Which was a shock. And he said, have you thought about, you know, seeing a lawyer and actually getting something done about it, you know, more than anything, but also for yourself? And I thought, So I went and visited a lawyer who said, don't even bother, it's going to cost you a fortune and you're going to, you know, it's going to cause you a lot of pain, and it doesn't work like that here in France. So I decided not to do it and not to go ahead with it. However, a couple of months later, a 14-year-old boy, had exactly the same accident as me and died. So that changed everything. That propelled me to think, well, this is not right. You know, this is not right. I should do something, even though, and I knew, I think in myself as well, that it would probably be healthy for me to just do it, to confront it, to look at it. I knew, I was pretty excited at the thought at first, maybe I'm going to get like $25 million or something. This would have all been worthwhile.
And you had some pretty funny ideas for the money too, should be said.
Yeah, I get to go to I had this image, I was like, wow. I was really excited. And then I realised, that didn't happen, and the reality came crushing down. I think that it was exciting, the thought that something could be commensurate as well with what had happened, you know, like that they would take it that seriously, but of course they didn't. Anyway, I'm glad that I did it. To this day, I'm really glad that I did it, because I would have always felt that was it real? Did that really happen? Was it my fault? Am I a complete idiot?
But the lawyer's original advice was right, which was that they're going to come after you.
Yeah.
It's going to be an ordeal, and you're going to have to relive it. And the two really shocking passages in that litigation are you being dragged up there to do a reenactment, which was just horrifying, and the day that you discovered the letters. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I don't think firstly, there's no way in the world I could have done this without M. He said, listen, we'll do it and I'll do all the paperwork stuff for you. Like, it's really easy for me. I know exactly what to do. I'll keep it away from you so that it doesn't affect you psychologically, because the lawyer, this sort of pompous English guy called Hogarth, he said to me, this is going to be really hard. What you're going to have to do is you're going to have to go back to all these people that you know, your theatre school, your family, your friends, and get them to say you had a career that was on the path of Kate Blanchett. Kate Blanchett, cut down in her prime. And you're over. It's over. You can never do anything again. You're stuffed, you know. And you know, at the time, I didn't really know either how stuffed I was. I knew that I couldn't act. I knew I was scared of being bumped. I wasn't sure how, was I going to have pain in my future? But I knew I was pretty okay. But anyway, I had to solicit these people, and including Adrian, and get them to write letters saying Jayne was an outgoing, happy person. Now she is a recluse. She has a face. She can't feel her face, so she can't act. My agent in Paris actually dumped me. I didn't even realise, but she wrote a letter saying I've taken Jayne off my books because she can't perform, because she's too scared of being in a room with other actors, and she has lost sensation in her face. She can't smile and perform to her capacity. All this stuff. But M said, I don't want you to look at those letters. I'm going to put them in a way. They have to be translated. I'm going to put them in a file. Just forget about it. But then one night I found them and read them. And yeah, that was one of the hardest parts of writing this book, actually. It was finding those letters again and reading through them.
Well, it's extraordinary as a reading experience, because you can't tell whether all of these people who are so close to you were doing what they were told by the lawyer and exaggerating the hell out of the harm, or whether it was what they really thought of you.
Yeah. 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 Horrible.
At the end of this book, and there are no spoilers. That's the great thing about talking about these stories. There's no way of spoiling this, but you say, perhaps I am glad that the accident happened. Why is that?
There's a few reasons for that. Firstly, because I'm a writer, and I was curious. It was it was an amazing thing to happen. I know that sounds insane. I was deeply sad and deeply lost and exhausted from spending 3 years trying to run away from sadness. And I think it allowed me to stop. I just got to... People felt really sorry for me when I'd gone back from Paris to my dad's place, and my whole life had been packed up, and I was injured and I was reclusive. I wasn't really speaking to anybody. People were like, oh, gee, this is terrible. And I remember thinking, no, you don't understand. This is amazing. This is so beautiful. Just being with my dad in the crunchy sheets, eating the meat and 3 veg, and just being alone with my mind, not having to do anything. It was a real gift. And I mean, now I feel sort of bad that I said that I'm glad because of being a writer. It's not really that. It's great to have a story to tell, that's for sure. But it really... I mean, the whole idea of My Sweet Guillotine is that it allowed me to truly connect with another person as well. I'd never had that in my life. I'd never slowed down enough to actually take the time to get to know somebody and make a friend the way that I did with M. So if it wasn't for that experience, I would not have met him, and I would not have taken the time to get to know what that was.
Now, Jayne, I heard Maya do a really clever thing earlier this evening where she forewarned the audience that she would be opening the room to questions shortly, but that she had some more questions before she did that, so that everyone had time to think about their questions. I prefer the element of surprise. So has anyone got any questions for Jayne?
I didn't see that coming.
Richard.
Thanks, Jock. I haven't read the books, Jayne, but I'd be interested to know if you've had the opportunity to go beyond Paris at all, in that Paris is held out as the ultimate primate city of a country, and I'm interested to know if the culture that you perceived in Paris was in any way different to what would have been the case in the provinces or away from the city.
Yeah, Paris is its own world. As soon as you step over the peripherique, you're in another world. and, you know, then you've got the world of the suburbs, and then you've got the world of the rest of France. In the first couple of years that I was there at the theatre school, I didn't have the luxury of getting out of Paris. I know that sounds crazy, but I couldn't afford to get... I was a student and I remember saying to Adrian at one stage, I just want to go to the beach in the summer. And he was like, you know, to go to the beach is the domain of the privileged. You know, you need to have a lot of money to go to the beach. It's not like Australia where we just go jump in. But I have got to know the greater France over the years, and the love of an appreciation of fine living, you know, of the market life, you know, the fresh food and nice, you know, hand-picked wine and all of that is a beautiful thing that's spread over the whole country. But my books are definitely Paris, 100% Paris focused. But I do, I absolutely love. I've got a great connection with a few of the different parts of the country as well. Yeah.
Jayne, have you done acting since, and why did you choose to buy a bookshop?
Yes, I have done acting since. So I did a production, actually, the first production that I did out after the accident. And after that period in Paris was a show at SDC in a devised work that involved me playing a character that was kind of messed, like physically rigid and fragile, which was actually perfect. And I did do a couple of other experimental works with some companies in Melbourne. But again, performing wise, I was physically very restrained for quite a number of years. But recently I developed, so I kept acting and doing, you know, voice acting in Paris, and a lot of like voiceovers in French with the little English touch. And then when I came back, recently I developed Paris or Die into a production with John Bolton, who is a theatre director from Melbourne, who went to the Lecoq School in the 70s, in the sort of Geoffrey Rush era. And that was an incredible experience. And I've been talking with Joe about actually doing the show here. It would be fantastic. I did a little bit of a regional tour, and then I performed it at La Mama recently. And that was an incredibly cathartic, actually cathartic was a word that came up a bit in Eliza's talk. I was like, oh yeah, cathartic. It's that was a very cathartic experience, because the book is so much about theatre, and then to be actually, and you'll notice when you read the books, there's a bit of a motif throughout about the cartwheel, that I can't do a cartwheel again. A cartwheel is a big deal. You know, in Australia, we're so used to chucking a cartwheel, but in the Lecoq School, when we went to do the acrobatics with all these people from all over the world who are all physically, you know, amazing, when it came to doing the cartwheel, they were learning how to do, they call it main, pied, you know, like hand, foot. And I remember just going, boom, and people were like, oh, you're amazing. And I was like, it's a cartwheel, but because we're from Australia, we have space and we're used to doing that. So there's a cartwheel in the show, and yeah, like I'm fully recovered my physicality, and but yeah, there was a long time there where I wasn't able to perform. And why did I buy a bookshop? Good question. We had been moving between countries for a couple of years with our daughter, and who desperately wants to live in Australia, of course, where she can do cartwheels. And we were over living back in Paris in 2019 when we heard that the bookshop at Queenscliff was for sale. And I said to my husband, oh no, who's going to take it over? I hope it's someone good. And he said, us. And I went, no way. And thinking that was just so far from my mind. But we talked about it for a long time and realised it was a really beautiful, it would be a beautiful thing to do, and it would make our daughter so happy with her little school up the street. And so we did. And then we had COVID. So that was, you know, kind of, yeah, insane. But it really grounded us in the Queenscliff community. And yeah, the bookshop has been just an absolute godsend. Joe and I were just talking about running bookshops before, and what a meaningful, beautiful, hopeful, joyful thing it is to do. Yeah, we haven't regretted it for a second.
And would this be a good time to point out that your husband is Matt, And that Matt starts with an M.
He does start with an M. Yeah, that was interesting. Like, I don't really have a formula for this. I just sort of do what feels right. And Kiki, she's not her name. The person that's based on it, her name isn't really Kiki. I actually asked her years ago, what would you like your name to be? And she said Kiki. And then she proceeded to name her daughter Kiki. So her daughter Kiki is really confused about the book. There's a Kiki character. It didn't feel right to give him another name, but at the same time, it didn't feel right to call him Matt. That felt terrifying. That would mean I'd have to really 100% get him right. Ugh. And then I realised he was Melbourne musician, the ultimate Melbourne musician, the MM. So he became M, which feels just feels right.
Are there any other questions in this one?
Jayne, can you tell us about you said this is part of a trilogy. Can you talk about the third book?
Yeah, I'm really excited about the third book. I feel like these have been my training wheels in lots of ways. The third book is called, Between Us, because it's contracted to come out in 2024. It's in my mind called Paradise. And there's this syndrome, I don't think we've talked about this yet, but there's this syndrome called Paris syndrome. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's specifically regarding Japanese tourists who arrive in Paris and they've got this idea of what Paris is from like being shown only the most clean, Emily in Paris, macaron images of Paris, and they arrive at Charles de Gaulle, which if you've ever arrived at Charles de Gaulle, you'll know it's a very ugly airport. And then you come through either in a taxi or on the train and, you're coming past refugees, you're coming past camps of homeless people, you're coming through the edge of Paris, the suburbs. It's a shock, if you... Bye, Eliza. Thanks for staying. See ya. Of course, Paris is not going to be what the postcard image when you arrive. But these people have not a clue that they're going to see anything other than this pristine image. And they have a psychological break. There's an actual ward in a hospital for specifically, right now, there's people in this ward, they cannot cope and they get airlifted back to Japan. So I just find that idea, and often, this idea of what a place like Paris is and what, Revolutionary Road, this idea of like what our dream life is and what we think is going to make us happy. And in the third chapter, so the books are set over a 10-year period in Paris, and in the third book there's a child, there's a musician and an actor, writer, who are trying desperately to find the perfect, ideal life in Paris. And the Instagram feed looks amazing, but underneath is this, it's not good. So M/Matt, he's gone very well with reading these so far. It's going to be interesting to hear what he thinks about the third book, but it's not pretty. So that's, I'm just gathering information for that at the moment and sort of thinking about that idea of the contrast. The books are really about, contrast, a lot of it, the juxtaposition, Paris, die, Sweet, Guillotine, and then Paradise.
There was a question from Ruth, I think.
I was just going to say, you spoke about how you didn't really feel that you had any roots as the French and the other. How long does the White Australian guilt continue? How many generations before we can identify completely as being Australian? In this multicultural world we live now, what is Australian?
I don't know. My instinct is to say probably never. I don't know when would it be, like when are we able to... the one thing I can say is that I started to feel at home after a long time, after really struggling to feel that, to understand that rootlessness. I do not feel connected here, I do not feel connected there, so what does that mean? And realising that I don't have to, actually. My connection can be not, I remember writing a thing, we don't live anywhere. What if we're not connected? What if we're not? What if that's okay? Like, what if we don't have to feel that we have a stake in this land. You know, what if we don't have to feel we have a stake in France? What if it's okay that I'm never going to be French, but I live there for my whole life? What if it's okay that I live in Australia for my whole life, but I'm not from there? But I am from there. I don't know. This is why it's a really hard question to ask. I don't know how we ever feel truly comfortable, because even, yeah.
It's the same in so many nations.
Of course. Yeah, of course. I think it's deeply, deeply complex, and I think it's deeply, and all we can do is acknowledge as much as we can the truth of how we feel. I think in Australia, one of the things I really struggled with was that we don't really talk, we placate, but we don't really go into the truth of, it's very hard to find the right words around it. It's almost like there's, why do we have to feel like it, why do we have to identify at all?
I thought the great point about that little passage was that the French, for them, it wasn't even a conscious process. They were just so intrinsically, inherently French in everything they did, and that was the beauty of it. And being a sort of a mestizo puzzle as we are, just stands in contrast to that.
Yeah, and I have to point out, of course, that I'm talking about very white French. You know, not the French, our friends that are from Algeria and from Africa, from places like Senegal, who have come over, and are French, but that have their own story of heritage and their own story of colonization. And the French aren't just completely lucky and they get to sit back and be like, we're French and our ancestors are French and we're totally, we have no, dirt under our nails. Like, we're all dirty. We're, most of us are, certainly the privileged people of the world that live, the oppressors, we all benefit from the oppression, and how to live within that, I don't know. But it certainly is easy to run away. That's one thing I've found. But it doesn't really help at the end of the day. We're still stuck with it. I don't have an answer. I'm interested to read more and explore more and listen more and talk to other people more, find out what their experiences are. But as time has gone on, I don't feel that same need as much to identify, and I don't feel that sense of loss. The more I pick myself up from the roots, it feels less oppressive. I don't know how, I'm just rambling. Please make it stop.
Not at all. I can make you stop because I notice we've gone miles over time, which is so easy to do talking about these books. And the great thing is that you may feel like you've now had a complete expedition across both books, but there's in fact still so much more in them that we haven't talked about, and they're really complex and rich and worth the read. So Jayne, thanks so much for sharing the books with us tonight.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Jo, and thank you, Dean, as always, for having us this afternoon. It's been terrific.
Thank you all so much. It's been wonderful to come here. Thank you, Jock. Thanks, Jo.